Working Cows Podcast, episode 136.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. This is Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows Podcast, powered by the Global Ag Network, and I'm here with another episode for you. We're going to talk to Hugh Aljoe. He is from the Noble Research Institute, and he is going to join us today to talk about a intentional management initiative that they have going on there at Noble in Oklahoma and that part of the world, working with people down there, but trying to break out into the broader context. I do want to let you know on the front end of this episode, we will be having a bonus episode this week. I'm going to release some highlights of my trip to Canada. I took my recording equipment up there and recorded a few episodes with guys like Don Campbell and some other folks up there, and had an opportunity to record some of the sessions. So I'm going to release just some highlights of that as bonus content this week, and then there will be individual bonus episodes coming out this week as well, or over the next few weeks. There'll be full episodes of what the highlights were, just a portion through the Patreon feed. So if you are wanting to support the Working Cows Podcast on Patreon, you can get access to some fresh bonus content coming out in the next couple of weeks and probably on into the next month or so with some of the stuff that I recorded up there. But for now, really excited to have Hugh Aljoe on today from the Noble Research Foundation. Hugh, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows Podcast.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here and glad to be a part of the communications that you're presenting to other producers across the country.
I don't know if Noble is a regional thing, but I was introduced to it at the Wally Olson Marketing School, and so I wanting to get a little bit more of a picture of what Noble is and what the organization itself does.
Okay. Well, the Noble Research Institute was created back in 1945 in order to just help producers here in the local area around Ardmore, Oklahoma, which is in the south central part of the state, and created by an old man by last name of Noble. And his focus was to try to help return the soil from its degraded condition back to something that would be a lot more productive to the farmers and ranchers, which were the main employees that were working with him on in the oil fields. So that's what started out in 1945, helping producers analyze their soils, trying to make recommendations to improve it, in which, if you have a little success in one area, it tends to grow. So producers began asking, what else could we be doing that you'd recommend? And that evolved into a consultation program and where we focused around integrated management. We had at that day would have been an ag economist, an agronomist, and a beef cattle specialist. And then that's evolved today to where we have a agronomist, which would be soils and crops, and then we have pasture and range consultants, which is my background. We have livestock, which is primarily still beef cattle production, ag economist, as well as horticulture and wildlife and fisheries. So depending on the resources for the Southern Great Plains, which is our focus, kind of where our expertise is tailored for, we're able to help farmers and ranchers. Now, since we have a new president as of, February 2019, our focus has been going national. What can we do to help farmers and ranchers across the country, specifically in around our central theme, which is land stewardship and grazing animal production for producer profitability. Looking at those three areas in which we can contribute back to farmers and ranchers, either through research, education, or consultation.
And what was the motivation behind, if I can use a term that you haven't used necessarily, but rejuvenating soils for Mr. Noble back in the 40s, right?
Yes, sir. Well, and that's and I like the term, and we like the term regenerative agriculture here at Noble, and that's what Mr. Noble was a part of. He was an early pioneer of aviation. So as he was flying to different oil fields, he got to fly across Oklahoma and other parts of the country, and he got to see the devastating effects of the erosion that occurred where lands that probably should
Hmm.
not have been farmed were, and then he lived through the Dust Bowl. And
Hmm.
Hugh Bennett, the founder of the Soil Conservation Service, is from Oklahoma too.
Hmm.
And between some of the connections, seeing what the land was left as, his family, he grew up in Ardmore, had a hardware store, and he saw where farmers and ranchers who could no longer pay their bills would leave their land titles with his dad and his uncle,
Right.
and therefore, he had compassion for these producers. They put everything into the land and then lost it. And then of course they acquire it, and then subsequently oil was found in the early 1900s, and his family benefited. He became a wildcatter. He wanted to be able to contribute back to Oklahoma. And as he was flying across the country, he said, if there's long after the oil is gone, the land still has to contribute to the food, fiber, and living for people that own the land. So it had to continue to supply back even after the oil was gone. The land was still important. So what do we need to do? And if the land had been good to him, he wanted to give back to the land itself.
Hmm.
So that's why he started it.
And that's literally from a 30,000-foot view that he kind of came to these conclusions.
It really was. It just broke his heart to see the erosion and the devastating effects that farming and probably not that people intentionally mismanaged land, but we see that we're still living with some of those effects in some parts of the country. We're just doing a better job of managing than we've ever done, and part of it is because of people like Lloyd Noble, Hugh Bennett, as he started the Soil Conservation Service, and then we continue to focus around our agricultural practices that can regenerate the soil, and we're seeing more and more of that all the time, and working with these innovative or entrepreneurial type producers that have invested enough time and effort into looking at what regenerative agriculture means to their own operations. We're getting a glimpse of what is possible in rebuilding the soils.
Very good. And so you mentioned land stewardship, grazing animal production for profitability. Are there more subsets beneath those kind of three emphasis, or what are you guys? How are you guys approaching it today?
Well, how we're approaching it is looking at all three of those areas as being critically important. We know that a producer has to be sustainable in the short term before he has an opportunity to be sustainable in the long term. So what do we need to do in order to continue to build the soil, build the foundation within these operations so that it gives them an opportunity to be economically viable to get from year to year, and then build the soils, build our infrastructure within our operations so that we have more resiliency over the long term, because we're going to have droughts. It's always not. We all look good in the good years. We've got favorable weather conditions. It covers a lot of mistakes.
Right.
But when we get into the droughts and we get into these periods of time, whether it's due to climatic conditions or as we're seeing right now, due to other variables that are beyond our control, we've got to have some ability in order to build resiliency. And at least from a producer standpoint, the variables that they have the most control over are within the land and the animals that they have on top of that land. So that's where we spend most of our time and effort.
One of the kind of the things that got us started down this road was Jason Meadows of the Ag State of Mind podcast reached out to me and said that he'd heard you speak at a conference and that you were talking about the intentional grazing side of things, was the words he used. What is kind of, how do you guys break up the management side of the agricultural endeavor?
As we look at our agricultural endeavors, we have to look at it all revolves around management. Too often we as producers, it's easy for us to get into a routine of just, as we all understand, working in the business as opposed to working on the business. We like to be outside. We like doing those things that bring us joy because of the energy that we exert. But the reality, the energy that we need to be focused on and ought to prioritize is around management itself. So as we look at it, you've got certain areas within a management system we want to focus on, which begins with intentional management of the pastures, then moving to the intentional management of stocking rate, then the livestock production, then get into our marketing, then move from there into the intentional management of our records and information systems, and then our personnel. All 6 of those combined, if we're working them in synchrony, should develop into a management plan that we begin to operate from year to year. And if we keep good records, then our previous year is going to be the template for the following year. And then we can adjust accordingly, looking at the areas that we were most successful in and the areas that we want to improve upon. But we've got to focus on those 6 areas to develop the management plan.
And you would say that every business needs to focus on these 6 areas. There isn't kind of a pick and choose type of a situation. Correct.
We all have our favorites. If we look in there and out of that list, the cattle. We're ranchers. We love the cattle operation, and oftentimes we want to make every other management area center around the livestock, but actually it needs to center first around the pasture management itself. It's the foundation. And we've always heard that let's say in a cow-calf operation, for example, the cows are the factory. The calves are the product. Well, we've got to look at our pastures, and all the management that goes into it is being the foundation of the factory. All the utilities that go into the factory. You better we've got to make sure that the factory can operate at its optimal before we can expect to have the factory produce any type of output. So we want to focus on, managing the pastures as well as we can, looking at what we tend to look at for regenerative agriculture, soil health principles. And within that, grazing management is probably one of the key, if not the key area that we need to focus on. And where that really begins then is making sure that we're managing a stocking rate that fits carrying capacity. And carrying capacity changes from year to year.
Right.
Or we stock conservatively enough to where we can adapt to the changes that occur in our climate or weather patterns.
I noticed there is for lack of a better way of saying this, there's an intentional use of the word intentional in the management. You're differentiating it from other types of management. Can you talk about what you think of as intentional management of pastures? How does that look on the ground level, around the kitchen table, some of those things?
Well, first off, let's say that we've got our stocking rate where we feel like we're relatively comfortable and it's evidenced. And what I really mean by evidence is that you go out there and typically as the spring occurs, you still have the residuals that you were expecting to have. You haven't overfed or you haven't supplied extra substitute feeding to your livestock program as spring begins. So that's the first place to start. And then what we really want to begin talking about is how do we manage our grazing? Very at the very beginning is how much residual do we need to be managing for? How do we begin to plan our grazing management? And for us, we find it a whole lot easier in order to obtain those regenerative type goals if you're in a truly applied, adaptive, rotational grazing program. And I don't mean setting it up as a clock where you're just rotating on a routine basis. Is that you're using visual cues to tell you whether you need to go faster or slower, or do we need to move cattle off because we're grazing more severely than we should at times when we should be gaining pasture, so to speak. So it's really looking at what are the cues within our pastures that we're actually trying to manage. With introduced pastures, we've also got to make sure that we're meeting the nutrient needs within that system. Paying attention to things like phosphorus and potassium. One of the things we've all learned is that soil testing is one of those key things that if you're going to apply fertilizer, you need to be doing, and how many people really do it.
Sure.
We don't do it routine. That's what intentional management is beginning to plan the things that are going to be of priority to you in the areas of fertility, in grazing management, managing the residuals. Where do you start? Where do you end? What are the areas that, or which pastures are your most productive? Do we really know? And those that are most productive is where we need to put more of our input, our time, our grazing management, be able to begin our subdivisions in those areas. Those are the areas where we need to be focusing on making sure that we have plenty of rest and recovery so that these pastures can rebuild and become more productive over time. That's where the resiliency comes, is making sure these pastures are never overgrazed for an extended period of time. And if they are, we got to make sure that we've got to allow plenty of rest and recovery following it to give it a chance to recover.
What are some of the visual cues that you talk about? And I want to maybe set the hook here with some pasture management stuff, but then
Okay.
I can see the declining listenership when we get towards the end of an episode. So I want to skip over some of these other things and work backwards through them and talk about personnel, finances, records, because those tend to be the biggest barriers to success in ranching. But I want to maybe set the hook here with some of these visual cues that you're talking about on when it's time to move.
Okay. Well, and what I'm really looking for, there's two things that we got to look: where you're at, and then where you're going. And because when we're at, we really want to make sure that we're not grazing too deeply into our pasture. We'd love to graze everything uniformly, but cattle are selective grazers. There are going to be some forages that they're going to like better than others. But if we have high enough stock density, we can tend to mitigate some of their selective preferences. But if they're going into a pasture, we'd like for them, let's say, for example, early in the spring and first part of the summer, perhaps, is you begin to just take the top part of the grass. And you got this leaf, it's got the little part that where it grows out of down there next to the soil, and then you got the leaf area itself, the true leaf component. Ideally, you take half the leaf component, and then you would move to another pasture. Now, the next pasture that you're going into, it ought to be flush enough and mature enough to where the key grasses that you're trying to key off of, which are usually your more productive, more preferred forages within the pasture, the very tips of those grasses might be just beginning to turn brown. You'll be able to see that they are mature. They've had plenty of photosynthetic activity, and it's really time to freshen them back up, which best way to do that is to top graze to stimulate new growth and continue the rotation. So those are the two things that we're looking for, because if you begin to get moving to some of these pastures and they're beginning to become overly mature, you may not be moving rapidly enough in your rotation.
Right.
Especially if you've got really good moisture conditions. If you know that you've had good rainfall, it's actively growing, the faster we want to rotate. As it begins to turn dry, now we've got to reset our minds and begin to think about, I've got to pace myself to where I can allow enough recovery for these grasses, knowing that they're not growing near as rapidly. To get to that same point, I may have to graze a little more than half that leaf. But you're always watching ahead of you and then looking where you're at, maybe just a little bit behind you, to see what that growth rate tends to look like.
I guess what's the balance between grazing the top third before it puts on a seed head and the ranch is going to get ahead of you at some point as far as grass is reaching maturity?
Yes, sir. Well, ideally, you expect it to. That's where you're trying to graze really rapidly. In most of our country, we're looking at, say, I just call it most of the native grasses that we would have in our country. You're looking at early growing season. They still need about 30 days rest and recovery before you come back. Then as it begins to get drier, you may move to 45 to 90 days, and in some parts of the U.S., especially as you get further west, you may be only looking at grazing it once, no more than twice a year, just to allow the rest and recovery that you need. But as you begin to allow it to get ahead of you, that's why you're just taking a third, so you can get around it all quickly enough to where you can have uniform grazing on those preferred grasses as much as possible. You're going to build the root systems. They continue to actively grow. We know that if we harvest over 50% of these grass plants, root growth stops. We never really want that root growth to stop early in the growing season, because it continues to provide more and more biomass for us to graze as long as it's actively growing. So, we're trying to balance that to the point where when it does become, moisture becomes somewhat limited, the pasture begins to grow, we can stay longer in a pasture because we're going to have to allow it more recovery. And we move from just top grazing to where we may be taking the top half of the plant, because now we're at a point where we have to continue to manage for the recovery period, as opposed to just grazing, the highly productive and nutritious grass that we typically see early in the growing season.
What's the relationship between a second pass in the dormant season on grass that's already obviously matured and put on a seed head that's been grazed once early in the growing season? How are we managing those relationships well? How much of that plant should be left behind if it's being hit after it's reached maturity, after an early growing season graze, or is that not going to be a realistic expectation for all parts of the country?
Well, I think it still is something we've got to pay close attention. Even in the dormant season, we can overgraze, and that's been a mindset change to a lot of the producers that I've worked with here in the South. But as we go into the winter, we're still wanting to take the leaf area. We want to make sure that we're grazing just the leaf portion of those plants. When we start forcing the cattle to consume more of the mature reproductive stalks, or some of the more high, let's say more higher lignin, but the higher lignin components of the plant, we're actually forcing those animals to consume plant parts that aren't going to be highly digestible, and it's going to slow, not only lower their quality of diet, but it's going to slow their digestive rate. So if we can keep them focused on that leaf area, let them take the good of the leaf and continue to move out. Whether you take it on one pass or two passes may not be as important, depending on where you are in the country, as to making sure that you take just the leaf and leave the residual. Because if we can leave the rest of the plant, as much of the reproductive tissues as possible, and that less digestible component of these mature plants, then we accomplish two things. We maintain more residual over everything, over the entire pastures, and we also ensure that those plants coming out in the spring are going to be healthier because they've been protected and insulated, from the elements over the course of the winter. So
Right.
We've actually achieved two benefits at the same time.
So let's move on to personnel. What is intentional management of personnel look like according to the Noble Research Foundation or Institute?
As we look at intentional management, what we're really beginning to do is identify on those areas where we have the most influence on any given time on an operation. And the reason why I said earlier, we start with the pastures because it is the foundation of all that we need to do. We've got to do what we need to do for our pastures as well as we can for as long as we can. And as we understand our pastures and our grazing well enough, then we can come back and know how to adapt our stocking rate, because our stocking rate is the number one factor that inhibits our ability to maintain our pastures in the long term. So we've got to make sure our stocking rate is the second thing that we're actively managing. And when we're doing that, we're looking at where are we within our weather conditions. Do we need to be more concerned about an upcoming drought, or are we managing our pastures for a favorable condition, which will be somewhat different? We have opportunities in those good years that we may not have, during these unfavorable conditions. Knowing where we are, and then utilizing our opportunities in order to take advantage of what might be out there, within these different phases.
Sure.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, how fluid is the stocking rate? I don't know if we could say how fluid should the stocking rate be as far as varying the stock density to the speed of the growing and the speed at which you're moving, getting all that stuff in sync. It seems to me like it's going to require some variability throughout the year of the stocking rate of the ranch.
Well, and it does. One of the key things that we've got to pay attention to is what are the moisture conditions within our soil. So if we understand our pastures well enough, we understand what that fluidity will look like. The other part of that is that stocking rate we probably can't adjust it quite as rapidly as the moisture conditions change. So we need to be able to look forward enough to where we can find out exactly what's happening and be able to have some sort of semblance of how to predict how much we want to vary our stocking rate.
So would it be possible to work backwards through these management, or do you think that's not a good idea? I know that you're saying that we're building kind of precept upon precept, but I was wondering if we could talk about personnel before we talk about livestock marketing and records and finance.
Yes. Well, in all reality, the things that we look at is the pasture management, the stocking rate, the livestock, and our marketing all have to be looked almost simultaneously. But the two components that make the management plan connected is going to be the records that we maintain and our personnel.
Right.
So the personnel are actually probably the most important asset that we have to an operation. And the better that they understand the management plan and their contributions to it, the more effective they will be and more valuable they'll be to the operation.
Right. And so in your mind, intentional management of personnel is making sure that everybody's kind of on the same page and that communication is happening so that people understand this is how we're managing the pastures. This is why the stocking rate is what it is. This is why we have the class of cattle we have. This is why we're marketing the way we're marketing. Is that right?
It is. And then it also goes all the way back to some of the fundamental things that oftentimes on a ranch we forget about. How many people have a job description for every position on the ranch? Even if you're a small ranch, you probably need to understand what the key job responsibilities are and how they connect back to the management plan. How many do a performance evaluation? Unless you're a part of a big organization, those performance evaluations, that constant feedback to the employees. Once they understand what the roles are, how well are they doing? And can we coach them along the way? What does that look like? Providing them education and expectation that they are going to educate themselves. You're going, as a manager, will help them become educated. These are the key things that we find that employees want to know. Oftentimes are a little afraid to or intimidated to ask. So it's up to the managers to be more proactive in connecting the dots between personnel and the management plan.
And anything else you want to say about personnel in that regard? It sounds like communicating through a job description, communicating through an education plan, communicating some of these other areas. Is there anything else that sticks out to you as far as intentional management of personnel?
Yes, sir. The key thing, another key aspect is the retention of these employees. What are you doing to keep them on the farm? You get a good employee. How do you make sure that they're rewarded appropriately? And a lot of times it's not just financially. If we know and understand our employees well enough, there may be other ways that we can show value back to the individual. Provide them responsibilities over certain aspects of the ranch or of an operation that would be meaningful to them. Being able to provide them the opportunity to go to NCBA or to the state cattle convention, and you pay for it. There may be something like providing them a vacation where they're going out and looking at potential bulls from another operation, but yet they're tying on a family vacation at the end of that.
Right.
Ways to find out what are the things that can help value that employee for the long term if there's somebody you really want to retain.
Yeah, it tends to be the biggest, most overlooked, I think, principle of management in our industry. And all the way back to episode 2 of the Working Cows podcast, we've talked about that
Yes, sir.
managing people
Does.
is the biggest barrier to success in the ranching industry.
And the biggest thing that most of these employees want to know is that their opinions matter. So ask them to be a part of the planning process as you go through the different seasons. You typically have a management plan at the beginning of the year. Talk through it with them ahead of time and implement some of the management suggestions they have. Let them know that they were heard.
How do you look at the intentional management of records and finance?
Records and finance, there are certain records and finance that are just essential for us to be making management decisions. Within an operation, they're going to look a little bit differently, but we've got to have enough information where we can maintain good annual, quarterly and annual reports, especially as you're looking at production measures, financial measures. We need to make sure that we have a good accounting system to where we can do enterprise analysis. In addition to that, we need to make sure that our budgets accurately reflect our enterprises themselves. And I think those are, and once we get those in place, do we have objectives, goals that we're trying to meet, key performance indicators that are meaningful to our own operation? And it may not always be, the pounds of wean, although it may be a variable that we need to know. But how does it influence ultimately dollars return per acre? It's not about the per head. It's back to the land. Dollars return, dollars margin per acre.
You intentionally separate records and finance. They're under one heading in the intentional management plan. But what are some of the different ways that those things can help you make a decision?
Well, what we're really looking for is, within the enterprise analysis, are the enterprises, do we have an acceptable return to management relative to the risk that's exposed? We may have some diversity in our operations, but are they contributing? And ultimately, sometimes it takes multiple phases within an operation. You got a cow-calf phase, for example, and then you got the stocker phase. You may have a reproductive female phase. All those need to have a margin back to the entire operation. You may have a hay component, but we need to get to the point where we can analyze the different areas and understand what those contributions are back to the overall operation. Our financial reports only provide a higher level overview, but it's the production records and then the enterprise analysis that gives us a total picture of what the return back to the operation from the different components of our ranch operation.
Let's jump to livestock. And I guess my question maybe on the front end of this is, do more ranches find themselves managing a year-round cow-calf type herd than probably should be, in your understanding, opinion, mindset?
I think that what we typically observe is that people want to run cows, and I use that somewhat loosely. we like having numbers of cattle, and more, again, loosely, is better in our minds. But what we really need to be thinking about is what are the animals that are really contributing. Back to our production records, if we have enough information, we can figure out which animals are actually making us money and which one are losing us money. Typically when we begin working with producers here, if they just would destock by 20%, get rid of the ones that are outside their optimal calving window, for example, you'll end up with a more productive herd. You'll also end up with a more cost-effective herd. So, when we begin to looking at running cattle, we probably need to be looking at what can we run as our base stocking rate with the cows, and then try to retain ownership or provide us other opportunities to bring in lease cattle if we have good growing conditions, or even maybe have a hay enterprise if we've got hay capabilities on some of the land. Begin to look at other enterprises that can integrate into a base cow herd in complement to what you're managing. So we don't put all our eggs in one basket. And as we both know, with the difference between a stalker and a cow-calf operation is a stalker, if you need to kind of get out, you've got a timeline anyway that you're going to be moving at least this set of calves out. There's a timeline. With a cow, you typically have depreciation that if you purchased her, you're continuing to carry. If they're something you've raised, you tend to overvalue the genetics, perhaps. So we're more reluctant to sell a cow on our place than we are a stalker. So therefore, having some sort of combination of enterprises really helps with the stocking rate. It helps with your pasture management, and usually helps with your bottom line. Just an example, we know that producers, if they spend quite a bit of time in there and they've got a good health program, a good nutrition program, they've got a set of producing, highly producing cows, and they've got some good genetics in the bulls, just retaining ownership on your calf. We oftentimes can see producers return as much or more net margin back to the operation in the subsequent phases of ownership of that calf crop as they did to the cow-calf unit itself. And just that one move, being a little bit lighter stock, being conservatively stocked, provides that opportunity for retained ownership of a product that you have focused a lot of your time and effort in order to build up. So why not carry those calves at least up to ready to go into a feed yard phase?
And that can be done with a terminal herd or a maternal herd. You can either capture value on the feeder side of it, or you can capture value on the bred female side of it. And so
Yes,
it's kind of an opportunity for both.
It is. And then if you get into dry conditions, you can eliminate whichever enterprise, at least temporarily, that's not being productive, that you can't afford to keep.
And so on the marketing side of things, that would be the last one on our list. What is in my mind, and you can correct me if you have another opinion, in my mind, managing depreciation is one of the other barriers to success in a ranching industry. And so how are we, through a good marketing plan, a good intentionally managed marketing plan, how are we managing depreciation?
The depreciation side comes with a couple of caveats. You've got the depreciation that often comes with the livestock animals. Then you've got the depreciation that comes with the equipment. To the extent possible, you want to reduce both. But the one, the side with the equipment is the one that we want to eliminate first, or try to get that down to the point where, we're not having to carry the depreciation longer than necessary. On the other hand, on the marketing, on the cattle end of it, we want to make sure that we're actually maintaining enough inventory where the depreciation actually is a benefit to the operation. And it's going to take a better accountant than I am, or an ag economist, to tell you where that is within your own operation. But there is a balance where if you're making money, where the depreciation is a benefit. But for most people on the marketing side, they just need to make a profit. And the more of the people that we've worked with here at Noble, what we see is that we're just trying to get them out of the red into the black. That's the primary reason why they come to us, is to try to earn more income. And what we typically try to do on that marketing is to help them with their marketing windows. Instead of just selling as they have historically, which would be whenever they wean the calf off, let's get them out of that fall slump, for example, and move them to a more advantageous part of the cattle cycle, cattle marketing cycle, which would be later in the year, toward November and December, or after the first, get into February, March, or April, and you end up typically with a better market for the cattle cycle. So those are the type things that we try to focus on, is to help them market their cattle instead of just sell their cattle. Think ahead, look at the markets, try to find, try to sell in marketing lots, a truckload lot whenever you can.
Right.
And hopefully they'll be of uniform type, breed combination as much as possible. And if you're large enough, in uniform sex. So
Right.
if you have a controlled breeding season, you'll have a more uniform calf crop. Those uniform calf crops usually lend itself to being more marketable. and do the things that you know you're supposed to do. If you didn't take the horns off through breeding, with a polled bull, be sure you clean them up early. Make sure you castrate the males that are going to be marketed. You just do the things that we need to be doing. If you've got an outlier, don't stick him in the group. Sell them separately. That one animal that gets distracted and you run through a lot is the one that everybody's going to see. So just move them out. You're going to take a little discount on that one, but better to take it on one than the whole group. The other part of it is that in a cow-calf operation in particular, you are going to have cull cows and bulls. Same philosophy. If you have extra forages and you can do it cheaply enough, move those culls out of the fall time period when everybody's selling culls. Add value to these animals cheaply if you can do that, and then market them at a later date. And if they're young enough, put the bull back out with them. They'll always sell more as bred animals than they will as open animals. Give yourself an opportunity to market these animals that'll fit into another person's operation and may work really, really well. But don't just say that they're culls and just marketing as such, because 15 to 20% of a cow-calf operation on an annual basis is typically from your cull animals. Don't dump them, sell them, market them properly.
So if you'll indulge me for a couple of minutes to kind of summarize what I've heard you say today, and you can correct anywhere where I might have misunderstood. If somebody is going to set out to intentionally manage their operation, they're going to examine their pastures and see what the forage cycle is telling them about when they should be calving, and then they're going to pair their herd back to the most productive 80% of the animals, and then they're going to be able to maybe have some more margin in their stocking rate to keep some animals around longer. And so maybe you don't need 600-pound calves to market in a load lot of like sex. You could possibly market 60,000-pound calves later on in their life in a like sex load lot, and be able to market in a load lot in a smaller operation. Would that be kind of a very broad overview understanding of some of the things that you guys are helping people think through?
Yes, sir. It's exactly where we start. And then, in another part of it, especially if they're a smaller producer, they need to keep in mind that for every 3 replacement females they're trying to raise, they can have 2 producing cows. A terminal program is almost always more profitable as a commercial cattle operation than a maternal focused operation. So the smaller producers they're selling weight. It's about efficiency. Purchasing females in that are bred to your operation and making sure that they fit the existing cow herd and the calving season that you've established, and then trying to become terminal. You can focus on your management skills around the simplest system that there is. And once you hone those skills, then consider what's that next step in order to add more value to your operation, maybe by looking more at a maternal herd, right, or bringing in stockers. You begin to look at your other options after you've managed the I won't say the simplest, but the least complex of your cattle type operations.
So it takes a higher degree of skill, or at least another set of skills, to market a maternal female than it does to market a terminal cross animal.
Well, it takes more to develop. It takes greater skill to develop them. You just you got to be on top of your game, especially on the nutrition side of your livestock, nutrition and health. You mess up just a little bit your opportunity that you might have had, or the advantage you might have had, you've lost it. So if you've got your terminal program and it's working really, really well, then you can begin to look at, which are the cows you would focus your maternal traits around, which would be your early calvers, the ones that are most productive, and then maintain an element of the terminal. But just stair step into it, because if you miss that opportunity, again, you're not going to get it back.
So just to make sure that we haven't glossed over that or people didn't miss it, to sell in load lots at 600 pounds, you're looking at 200 females or 220 females to get you 100 marketable steers and 100 marketable heifers. If you could pare that down to 120 and market those as 1,000-pound animals and still be able to market them in load lots of like sex, in western South Dakota, 40 acres per cow-calf pair, we're talking about 1,600 less acres that you could run on if you're working with, or actually 3,200 acres, 3,200 less acres you could run on if you're looking at 120 as opposed to 200.
Well, and you may not be able to reduce it quite that drastically, but that's the ideal. You wouldn't take it near as many acres in order to run and produce more pounds.
Right.
Because you're carrying those calves longer. That's the objective. And even if you're smaller, still trying to carry those calves up as heavy as you can, and then marketing them at some of your more prestigious, but some of your better stocker and yearling markets within your area will always be a benefit. Trailer loads hauled 2 hours away is still going to be more profitable than just dropping those calves at weaning or some time that's convenient to you.
Yeah, and obviously mine is an oversimplification and very much back of the envelope math, but kind of just communicating that ideal, or the idea of maybe retained ownership is an opportunity.
Well, and that's where we really want to start. If you've got a good set of cows, which means cull the ones that are the outliers, making sure that you've got a good set of bulls, a good herd health program, a nutrition program that complements calving within the appropriate time frame where your breeding season's right when you've got your peak quantity and quality of forages. A good terminal program will allow you to make better use of a retained ownership program. You would benefit.
So breeding season being at peak quantity and quality, or calving season, or both?
Yeah, to me, you at least want to look at your breeding season being at the peak quantity and quality. Down here in the South, we can calve a little earlier than what most people would there in the northern states. So you have to balance it out depending on what part of the country where you're at. But you at least want to be sure that your breeding seasons, you're going to have plenty of quantity and plenty of quality. And for the north you go, it may be the calving season needs to be aligned with that.
Sure. Appreciate that. And I really appreciate your time today, Hugh. Any links you want me to share? The show notes page for today is workingcows.net/136. workingcows.net/136 is the show notes page for today. So do you have any links or events coming up that you want me to share there?
Okay. Well, one of our links is www.noble.org. And if you look on that, you can be able to find a lot of the information that we have. We've got a monthly newsletter that we send out. You can sign up for. You just follow the links. If you're looking to visit with someone, we've got consultants that, as I said earlier, are in pasture range, beef cattle, ag economics, soils and crops, as well as wildlife fisheries and a little bit on horticulture. So there's an opportunity to visit with individuals here at Noble. Knowing that our focus tends to be the Southern Great Plains, we do have a national focus when it comes to regenerative type agriculture production.
Very good. Any major oversights today? Anything we didn't quite cover sufficiently, or anything else you want to share?
I think that we've covered it. I think we've done a pretty good job of covering all those points in a short period of time. But if anyone would like and visit about any particular point more, they're more than welcome to try to contact us here at Noble Research Institute.
Yep, absolutely. Every one of those can and has been one full episode, and you still feel like you're only scratching the surface. So,
well, you really do. But I do want to commend you for the just the amount of information that y'all are able to produce. You're able to produce, because it has been a joy just to be able to listen in to the podcast with the speakers that you've had. So I appreciate what you're doing and appreciate being able to offer some of this information. And as you need or would like, we'd be happy to visit again.
Yeah, I mean, the ecology part of it is intriguing to me, that got added in, and kind of how that happened is interesting to me for sure. And like I said, any one of those could be a deep dive anytime. So,
well, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks for your time.
You bet.
Well, it was a joy to talk to Hugh, and I look forward to future partnership with Noble and just continuing to expose people to the stuff that they're producing down there. Real good content coming out of there, so keep an eye there. As I said in the intro, we're going to release a bonus episode 137, coming out this week with the some of the highlights from my trip to Canada for the Holistic Management Canada and Organic Alberta conference. And then also next week, I had the opportunity to talk to a NASCAR crew chief. I interviewed a NASCAR crew chief about managing people problems. So that's kind of what they do as NASCAR crew chiefs, is manage people and manage schedules and all those different things. And so he reached out to me and said, "Hey, I love your podcast. I'm implementing some of the practices on my farm and on my ranch." And he said, "But I also manage people. If you ever want to talk about it, let's do it." And I said, "Sounds awesome." So coming up, episode 138 with Taylor Moyer, NASCAR crew chief for junior motorsports racing. So I think that'll be interesting perspective for you guys.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.